Hi, Connie. How are you?
Having a bout of insomnia.
Are you? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Good stuff.
Yeah, I'm glad I got two computers so I can look at the PowerPoint and watch this thing at the same time. I'm still getting used to my new computer. My son sent it to me, and it's a little bit different than the old one that's 10 years old.
Well, since you're the first one on, tell me if you can see me. I'm going to be Father Tim.
Oh, okay.
Good.
Yes. Take your mask off so I can hear you. Talk.
Dr. Evely has joined us.
I can't follow me.
Hi, Connie. No, I was going to print them out and I realized there were 31 of them. And I said, okay, I'll just look at them on my screen. Oh, my glasses are a mess.
Okay. You don't need it. Right.
Kevin, I'm zooming for an hour and a half, so please listen if she wants to go outside, okay?
Hey, Doug.
Hi, Doug.
Hi, how are you, Teresa?
Not too shabby.
Good.
How about you?
Doing all right.
Look at Pete.
I can't get my,
I love your screen
I
background.
can't get it. I'll turn it off. I don't know what's wrong with it.
Okay,
Oh, that's cool.
I'm gonna show you. Go to the bottom.
Yeah,
There's video, there's stop video. There's an arrow beside the video.
okay, yeah,
Click on that. And it says choose virtual background.
okay,
And you're gonna click on that and you're gonna put none.
okay.
And then you won't be an alien from Mars anymore.
I don't know if it doesn't think it's working.
I'm just glad that Friar Tim is recording this because you'll never live this one down,
Oh,
Pete.
no, I'm gonna disappear if you're not nice to me.
Pete, you know what you really look like? You're the color of the creature from the Black Lagoon.
Exactly. Well, that's why I am anyway. Linda always tells me that. I don't know, it's not working, Therese.
I don't know what else to say. Maybe Megan. Megan, you're a younger
No,
Zoom.
they're trying to help me. I'm sorry to be such a pain.
Maybe you need to go out and come back in again, possibly.
Okay, I'll try it.
Okay.
Like, if it's like Windows, if it's not working, turn it off and then turn it back
Yeah,
on.
I know.
Yeah.
See you later, creature.
Okay, I'll be back, maybe. Stop video.
She might not be able to sign back in.
You want to use mine?
No, I'm okay. I can see people otherwise. Yeah.
Here's Dr.
Welcome,
Lansing.
Dr. Lansing.
There's 21 people that signed up for the Zoom. So I'm about 9 or 10. Yes, I've got the mic set up for you and your PowerPoint. So.
Hi, Therese.
Hello, George. How are you?
All right, how are you?
I'm good. I'm good. See if anyone else is trying to get in. I think you probably need to start. I feel bad.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. We'll continue with our survey of American Catholicism by looking at the particularly American part of this. Now, where we left off last week is the 13 colonies had formally broken from Great Britain. As you know, every Roman Catholic institution, every Roman Catholic has to belong to somebody. The 13 original colonies had fallen under the ecclesiastical jurisdiction of the Apostolic Vicar of London, as the term was called, a mission bishop of London. And once the colonies declared their independence, the mission bishop of London said, sorry, Huns, you're no longer mine. You don't belong to my country, you're no longer under my authority. Have a nice day, stay warm and well fed. And essentially what this means is that without a bishop, there could be no ordinations, there could be no confirmations, and there could be no ordinary government of the Catholic Church. Moreover, since the Vicar Apostolic of London had been obligated to send priests to staff the 13 colonies, he was no longer under that obligation. So in fact, the number of Catholic priests had halved during the Revolutionary period down to 14. And they were all getting elderly. So the question is, how exactly is this new American church going to govern itself? And the figure that comes to the fore is John Carroll of Baltimore. Remember, we already saw him last week. He was the nephew of Charles Carroll of Carrollton, the ultimate Catholic signer of the Declaration of Independence. He was also the plenipotentiary, that is, one of the ambassadors sent by the Continental Congress to try to incite the Canadians into joining the
Damn thing.
He was a known quantity to the Holy See. He came from a wealthy Maryland family, had entered the Society of Jesus after being sent for his university education at a Jesuit college in France. And with the suppression of the Society of Jesus in 1773, he became a diocesan priest of the Vicar Apostolic of London. In 1784, the Holy See names him Mission Superior. And when he's named as Mission Superior, that gives him, they gave him one major task, which is gather together the priests of the United States and tell us what you want to do. Because frankly, the Holy See didn't have the vaguest idea of what situations were like in the United States. First of all, the United States, the colonies, had never known the figure of bishop. There had never been an Anglican bishop, much less a Roman Catholic bishop. So the Holy See, this was completely unknown territory, and the Holy See, in all of its time, had never dealt with a republic. So the Holy See used its normal protocols. The Holy See sent a letter to its nuncio to the King of France and asked him to buttonhole the American ambassador to the King of France, a certain Benjamin Franklin, and request of Benjamin Franklin who would the American government want to be named as the first bishop in the United States. Because again, that's what they used to do with the crown heads of Europe. Who do you want to be the bishop here? So Franklin wrote back to the Congress wrote back and said, A, we could care less who the bishop is. B, we could care less whether there's a bishop. C, we simply don't care. There is separation of church and state. And the Holy See, frankly, did not know what to do. So they wrote Carroll and said, okay, you guys over there pick a bishop, and whoever you pick, we're fine with. Secondly, pick a city, and whatever city you pick, we're fine with. And three, do you want to be a diocese or an apostolic vicariate? Now, what's the difference? As an apostolic vicariate, this is a mission diocese that does not have its own full independence. So the American clergy met and said, A, we want to nominate John Carroll. B, the old-fashioned Catholic area in the old colonial countries was the colony of Maryland. And the largest city by this point in the colony of Maryland was Baltimore. So we want Baltimore to be the see of this diocese, the see city of this diocese. And C, you want it to be a full diocese, because we don't want to let the rest of the American population think that we're too much under the control of the Roman Pontiff. We want to very clearly make this into something American. So they write 6 months, the letter takes to go over to Rome. 6 months, the letter comes back saying John Carroll can now be the bishop, but there's no bishops to consecrate him. 6 months, he has to come back over to England, get consecrated, and come back. So he becomes Bishop of Baltimore formally in 1789. In 1791, he takes the first steps to founding an indigenous American clergy. First, while he was in England to be consecrated a bishop, the major superior of the French Society of Saint-Sulpice. The Society of Saint-Sulpice is a French community of priests who dedicate themselves to seminary service. The Jacques Emery, the Father General of the Sulpicians, this is 1789, 1790, read French Revolution, read guillotine. Emery was terrified that his congregation would be wiped out. So Emery said, we will give you priests, a few seminarians, books, and we'll take care of the seminary. We'll pay for the whole thing if you just let us open up in Baltimore. Not a bad deal. 5 Sulpician priests came with 2 seminarians, and they opened up in 1791 the institution that I was proudly the academic dean of for 14 years. St. Mary's Seminary University, Baltimore, Maryland. In order to provide young men for this, Carroll also founded Georgetown Academy, which has since become split into Georgetown Prep and Georgetown University. So this was the whole goal was to have an indigenous clergy. In 1808, the United States was so large that the Holy See created Baltimore into an archdiocese and named 4 other dioceses from it: Boston, New York, Philadelphia, which all makes sense, these are big major cities, and Bardstown, Kentucky. Why Bardstown, Kentucky? Beginning in the 1790s, poor Catholic workers in the southern part of Maryland had heard that you could get through the Appalachian Pass and make your way into the Indian country of Kentucky, where you would have a lot of land and it was all free and very fertile. So thousands of southern Maryland Catholics made the trek through the Appalachian Trail and came and settled into Kentucky around the city of Bardstown, which is still, next to New Orleans and Baltimore, the oldest Catholic kind of center. It also happens to be the best center for bourbon distillery, but that's another whole question. The 2 of them are rather intertwined, to be bluntly honest. But the Diocese of Bardstown was the 4th of these dioceses. In order to complete kind of the early picture, an English convert to Catholicism named Elizabeth Ann Seton, St. Elizabeth Ann Seton, approached Carroll for support in founding a religious community of women dedicated to education. And this would be the Daughters of Charity. Now, this is kind of the brief chronology. What kind of church did Carroll want? First of all, Carroll looked at Europe in the 1790s and saw that the church was in a mess. The French Revolution had suppressed the church. Revolutionary ideals had spread all through Europe. The church was being disestablished and being marginalized, if not actively persecuted. And Carroll's understanding was the thing that did that to the church was being too tied and close to the government. Therefore, the American notion of separation of church and state is an absolutely good thing, because that lets us build a completely free and independent church. By the way, this contravenes Catholic doctrine, because Catholic doctrine stated that the Catholic Church best thrived when it was supported and paid for by a Catholic state. Secondly, this is going to be a national American church. It's not going to be a dependency of France, and it's not going to be a dependency of the Vatican, and it's not going to be a dependency of any European power. We are uniquely American. By the way, American Catholic Church history is unique in the entire history of the Catholic Church because we are the only church that has never either been A, an established church, or B, a persecuted church. So we know neither of the 2 extremes. So for us, living in place where there is a separation of church and state is a completely natural, national, beneficial, and happy kind of an experience. When that occurs, that allows for people to naturally grow in virtue. Because if there were some kind of a religious test for political office, for example, then people would suck up to that religious test. You know, people, if you happen to be a Catholic, everybody would want the letter of good conduct from their pastor, and suck up to and get all this, and get preferential treatment. Whereas, in a place in which all religions are equal, and all religions compete on an equal playing ground, and all religions have to be accountable one towards another for things like scandals, for things like money, for things like behavior, this would encourage virtue and a sincere religious sentiment and a sincere religious pluralism. The other thing that Carroll wanted, and frankly never got, was a spiritual church free of management issues. You know, no one likes to talk about the dark, ugly secret of how does the Catholic Church finance itself. But it is a major issue. No one likes to talk about it. It all seems a little dirty. No one kind of avoid it, but it is a necessary issue. Carroll wanted to separate that as much as possible, never really managed to do it. What he believed was that grace and nature worked together. And the word that is used is transformationist. That is, grace and nature work so closely together that Connie will always slowly and incrementally grow in grace if she simply cooperates with all the things that are going on. There don't need to be these rough turns this way or these rough turns that way. Slowly but incrementally, we will grow in grace. It's a tremendously optimistic view of spirituality. The piety would have been exactly the piety of colonial Maryland. Here we're talking about a sober, uplifting, and restrained piety. We're not talking about the piety of your typical Southern Italians or Mexican Americans at Guadalupe. We're not talking about exuberant rosary processions. We're not talking about May crownings. We're not talking about throwing flower petals before the Blessed Sacrament. We're not talking about any of these kinds of very exuberant forms of piety. Sober, quiet, you come to the liturgy, you respond, you go home, you grow in virtue. Very sober, very restrained. The symbol of this is the cathedral that John Carroll had built in Baltimore. Now, this is the beginning of the 19th century. In your head, when you think of a traditional Catholic church, you think basically of a great big Gothic church, because that's the image. And of course, Gothic harkens back to the Middle Ages. Gothic harkens back to the great cathedrals of Europe. And it has this whole kind of making its way up to heaven feel. Carroll deliberately refused to build anything that looked too, quote unquote, Catholic. He built neoclassical, almost like a Greco-Roman temple. And if you know Baltimore geography, he planted this cathedral right smack in the middle of downtown Protestant Baltimore. As if to say, we're here and we ain't going anywhere. Now, there's another interesting piece to this. You look at the inside of the Baltimore Basilica. In the 1940s, they did a bad restoration job and put in stained glass windows. Cardinal Keeler, about 10 years back, had the stained glass windows removed, and he had the dome reopened for an oculus and a clear story. The windows in the Baltimore Cathedral are clear, and they are deliberately so because he wanted all of the Protestant neighbors to feel perfectly free to snoop in the windows and see if we were doing anything strange. From the other end of it, he also very clearly believed that what we were doing was so sober, so pious, and so restrained that would it's all bright, it's all illuminating. It's a very clear theological symbol behind all of this. This is what Carroll wanted to do. Essentially, Carroll lays the groundwork for an American church. When I taught this, I would always ask the seminarians to reflect on this question. Are we talking about an American church, American Catholic Church, or are we talking about the Catholic Church in the United States? Because we always wrestle with how distinctive are we from the rest of the world, and how special we are with the rest of the world. Again, this is what cultural commentators today call American exceptionalism. It occurs within Catholicism as well. Because, as I pointed out, our history is completely unique. Moreover, because our history is completely unique, the way in which the Holy See approached Ben Franklin about naming a bishop, that's not the last time that's going to happen. The Holy See, frankly, has virtually no idea how to understand us. Because we are, even today, exceptional. For example, notwithstanding the horrible time of clergy sex abuse, which I'm unfortunately afraid is going to be reopened with the publication of the McCarrick report today, we remain 20 to 25% of the population, and mass attendance remains between 25 and 35%. In many countries in Europe, mass attendance is 3 to 5%. They simply do not understand why we have so many full churches, because it's inconceivable to them. So, this vision that Carroll had, why didn't it really work all that easy? First, he had to start everything from scratch. Really, he was making it up as he was going along. And some things he did well, some things he did poorly. But the sheer difficulty of starting anything from scratch. Second, while he had St. Mary's Seminary, it simply did not produce enough priests to meet the need. And therefore, there were immigrant clergy. The dirty little secret of the United States is that we have always been dependent upon priests from overseas to come and give us the service that we need. Anybody of a certain age in the American Southwest or the American South stands a very good chance of having their sacramental needs met when they were young by a priest that got kind of bought out from maybe seminary in Ireland. Because American bishops would simply go over and try to recruit seminarians to come in. So in the South, the last bishop of Savannah, too bad, was what's called an FBI, foreign-born Irish. And his brother was the bishop of Kansas City, Missouri, another FBI. The American church has never been able to produce the number of priests that it needs, or that it wants. Okay? So this goes back right to, and the immigrant clergy simply don't have this idea behind it. Third, John Carroll was able to name his own successor, another Maryland Jesuit named Leonard O'Neill. However, once the other dioceses were named, the Holy See said, "Thank you very much, we'll appoint the bishops." And they felt free to appoint whoever they wanted. So one of the first bishops founded, Bishop of New York, the first bishop of New York or Boston, I believe New York, was named the Bishop of New York as a consolation prize because he lost the election to become the minister provincial of the Dominicans in Ireland. Perfect preparation for a mission diocese in New York. So the American clergy lost the control of this. In the midst of the revolution, the clergy tended to be more conservative. Carroll's vision looked a little too revolutionary. By the way, Carroll also promoted things like the use of English in the liturgy. He also wanted to be as completely independent from the Roman pontiff as he possibly could, both of which were considered a tad suspect at the time. So Carroll's vision never really took off. America was so big, so poor, so new, and so vast that it was hard for anybody to wrap their heads around the whole thing. And then immigration rapidly begins to happen and changes the church. We'll stop here on the immigrant piece because we'll talk about immigrants next week. Now, there's one other difficult piece that happens at the time. Something that nobody really thinks about. What is the legal structure of the Roman Catholic Church? What's the legal structure of dioceses and parishes? Who owns the land? Who owns the property? And what do we do with the property? The very first original plan was called trusteeism, in which each parish had a set of trustees. Now, we might think parish council, but think parish council that had executive control over finances and maintenance and buildings and property. Carroll's original idea was that the lay people would handle all the money, and the priests and the bishops would handle all the spiritual things. Except he found out that there's nothing but 70 years of fights. 70 years of fights, leading in some cases to bishops interdicting churches. An interdict of a church means the bishop formally closes the doors and forbids the celebration of all sacraments within that church. The excommunication of trustees, sometimes the excommunication of priests that took the side of trustees, priests getting beat up and thrown into harbors, etc., etc. 70 years of a lot of ugliness. Now, if you were to read an older book on trusteeism, it would purely be painted as bad laity, usurping the power of priests and bishops. Purely, that's how it would be read. More contemporary scholarship is a little more nuanced. There are some real canonical concerns. There's also the whole question, frankly speaking, of ethnic stuff. So the first ethnic group that controlled it was often not kind to the newcomers and the non-people that didn't belong in that. So there's a whole series of these problems that come in. There's a long background to this. In Europe, the wealthy would endow a church or endow a seminary or give the land, or the government would provide the same thing. So people were very used to either the government or the wealthy providing their church for them. Well, in the United States, the government was not going to do that. So therefore, the wealthy, and again, the wealthy at this time, think of like the local Irish barber, okay? The German guy who owned the dry goods store. I mean, these are not like exorbitantly wealthy people, but they have a little bit of means. That they would naturally step up and found these. Typically, what would happen is that Catholics in a neighborhood or a city would gather together into a benevolent society. And they would pool their resources. And then once they had enough money, they would approach the bishop and ask for permission to start building a church. Usually the bishop would say, as long as you have the money, knock yourselves out. Then, when the church was open, they would ask for permission for a priest. Sometimes the bishop would say, find one on your own. So somebody would write back to their second cousin, who was languishing in some diocese in Ireland, and was 87th in line to be the next pastor, and he'd happily get on a boat and come over. But what happens if the bishop didn't receive him? And then when the bishop actually showed up to consecrate the church, the argument was, please hand over the deed of the church. We paid for it. We own it. Yeah, okay. Take care of it. Okay. This priest that you found, I'm sorry to tell you, but your second cousin is a down out drunk. He came and presented his credentials to me and he fell down the steps. I'm not going to make him your pastor. I paid for his passage. Yes, he is going to be my pastor. All of these tensions in American thought, people simply thought we could just write up a nice constitution and create a nice contract and everything would go smoothly. But the real issue is what is called voluntarism. Voluntarism is the system that says that you voluntarily fork over X number of dollars every week in order to support your parish. Who administers that? How much is it? Who invests it? Etc. These all create tense questions. American corporate law simply understood that the way in which Protestant churches found themselves, that is, the vestry, the council, owned the property, hired and fired the pastor, took care of all of the issues, and when there were financial or tax issues to have to deal with, you dealt with the vestry. Roman Catholic canon law doesn't quite work that way. The laity looked at all of this justly and said, this bishop doesn't have 2 dimes to scrape together. We're doing him a favor by raising this money, recruiting these priests, and building these churches. Can we cooperate with it? Or does it have to be antagonistic? And generally, Carroll tried to be as cooperative as possible, and in a few places it actually worked. By the way, one of the places where it always worked pretty well is the Modifié system in New Orleans, in the old French parishes in New Orleans. There, the French marshals that did this, they learned to do this in Europe, and they did this very well. It didn't work so easily in the former 13 colonies. Finally, in 1829, the Provincial Council of Baltimore says, canon law in the United States means this. The bishop owns all property. He is what is called the corporate soul. Each parish is separately incorporated, and the incorporators include the bishop, the vicar general, the pastor, and 2 appointed lay trustees. Read that closely. Who's always going to win? The 3 clergy. The 3 clergy are always going to outvote the 2 lay, which is exactly how it was designed. What do these trustees do? Order. Riots broke out sometimes. So these people maintained order. Education. if the parish wanted to open a school, it was the trustees that hired the headmaster and paid the headmaster and paid the teachers. And the administration of all the temporalities. Where do they raise money? They raise money up until the early part of the 20th century. All Catholic churches lived on pew rents and special collections. What are pew rents? Pew rents would be this. The economy, you're up in front. All right, so I'll pick on you. The Edley family, in order to get the front row in church, the Edley family pledged $1,000 a year to the parish. That was their rent of the front pew. No one else could sit there, ever. This was Connie's seat. Which wasn't bad if everyone was more or less in the same socioeconomic category. But what happens when there are 6 people sitting and 300 lining the walls standing because they're too poor to rent? If you go into some older churches in the Northeast, you can still find a few that have a little gate, and on the gate is a little brass slide that has the number. And on the parish books, the Edley family had seat 3A. That was hers. And that's the way it maintained for the longest time. By the way, this lasted in New England in weird ways for a very long time. As a young priest, I was in a parish in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And as the youngest associate, my job was to put out 4 baskets, each of which had $5 worth of quarters in them, at the 4 doors of the church. Because the parishioners had been instructed that when you walk into church, you drop a quarter in that basket. And if you don't have a quarter and you have $1, you take 75 cents back out. And I looked at this and I said to the pastor, I said, Cyril, this is an antiquated system that hasn't been around for like 100 years. Can we get rid of this? And he looked me straight in the eye and said, when you find $18,000 for the budget, we'll get rid of it.
Was that seed offering?
Yeah, seed offering. Yeah, seed offering.
Yeah, seed offering.
Seed offering. It's the old thing with pew rent. Seed offering. The cathedral in Springfield, Massachusetts actually had a ticket station where you came in, you got a bunch of quarter, you got the ticket to go into church. It has these things going. Now, the oligarchy, the upper class founders and pew holders. We talked about that. The other thing is, if the church goes belly up, who's really responsible? Because the trustees, of course, wanted the position, but they're not going to fork out of their own money to rescue the church. So a very common way of resolving this problem was wait for the trustees to screw up, the church would go belly up, and the bishop would buy the church out from under them, and they get rid of the trustees. Now, this gets into the very odd thing of, because we're so unique, how actually do we function as a church? Some of the other pieces to keep in mind. We're already getting lots of immigrants, including immigrant bishops and immigrant priests. One of the dirty little secrets about the United States is we're not always welcoming to strangers. So there was an inbuilt bias to some bishop that would come in and demand his rights, or some pastor that would come in to demand his rights, or some new ethnic group that would move into the neighborhood and demand to have seats in the church. There's this dirty little ugliness about us. Secondly, a lot of times this was ethnic and social. It was ethnic, the Irish didn't want to let the Germans in, the Germans didn't want to let the Irish in. It was social, the upper class didn't want to have to worship in the same church with their servants and housemates. So there's social tension and ethnic tension tied up in here as well. There's also a wider issue in the church at the time. After the revolution, after the French Revolution in Europe, a cry was to have a free church in a free state. The clergy who rallied around this slogan basically did not want anyone, the government or rich lay people, to tell them what to do. So there is this little ugly thing of clerical control that flops into this. By the way, the diocese, 2 points. The corporate soul system, beginning in the 1980s and 1990s, smart lawyers realized that the hierarchical structure of the Catholic Church of the United States, corporate soul, in which everything is in the name of the bishop, is a tort lawyer's dream. Because bishops put abusive, pedophile priests in parishes and knowingly left them there to harm children. Ka-ching. It got us into a lot of trouble way later. Also in this early period, the American distrust of foreigners, natives. It begins in the United States around the year 1835. By the way, did anybody ever see the movie The Gangs of New York?
I did.
Okay? The Gangs of New York is based on real life stuff.
Yep.
And if you notice, it's the Americans against the Irish Catholics.
Yep.
Right? There's a scene in that movie in which the nativist gang, led by Daniel Day-Lewis, comes to attack the Catholic Church and burn it down. And there you see all these Irish laborers with their pitchforks and their shovels and their hammers. And in the middle, you see the figure of a bishop. It's based on Bishop John Hughes of New York, who signed his name Cross John, and his enemies called him Dagger John. And Dagger John, when the nativists were threatening to burn down Catholic churches, Dagger John put out an op-ed in the New York Times stating, "If a single Catholic church in New York is put to the torch, I will personally raise up an army of 10,000 Irishmen and turn Manhattan into another Moscow." After Napoleon's burning. Golly gee, not a single Catholic church was ever hit in New York. Nativism. Beginning 1835, the first economic depressions, upheaval, lots of immigrants. Of course, it's the fault of the immigrants and the typical nativist growth. The fastest growing religion in the United States was Roman Catholic, which was still considered to be something different, weird, and foreign. By the time of the Civil War, we were in fact the largest religious group in the United States. Although Carroll wanted the American Catholic Church to be extremely American, by the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s, it looked poor, threatening, and foreign. Catholics were seen as being different, and therefore persecuted. Interestingly, if you were to come up with a caricature of the most different and weird-looking aspect of Catholicism that you could possibly find the image of a Roman Catholic nun in a traditional habit. Just think of the Daughters of Charity with the wings and the big, long, flowing stuff. Nothing looks stranger, weirder, or more exotic to your typical American Protestant than a Roman Catholic nun. There is a whole spate of anti-nun literature, the most famous of which is called The Awful Disclosures of Maria Monk, who claimed that she had been a novice in a monastery of nuns in Montreal, where the nuns and the priests engaged in orgies, and she was treated to sadomasochistic behavior, and there were all kinds of depravities that were going on. Most American religious women at this time made their money by having boarding schools for young, proper girls, like in the Downs of the Sacred Heart. Good Protestant families were said, never send your young daughters to these schools because they will become depraved sex slaves of these priests. And Maria Monk traveled from city to city, barnstorming. It's really fraudulent, of course. Barnstorming and inciting riots against Catholics. There were anti-Catholic riots, Boston 34, New York 41 before Dagger John, Philadelphia 44, Louisville 55. A lot of this stuff was anti-Irish and anti-Catholic. Anti-Irish, anti-Catholic. In 1853, the Pope decides, let me feel out the waters about maybe I should send an ambassador to the United States. So he decides that he's going to entrust a couple of ancient maps to an archbishop who's on his way to Brazil for an international World's Fair, and he's going to show these maps off. And incidentally, he stops in the United States for like a 3-month tour. The nativists hounded him out of each city in which he found himself. It was so bad that he finally left the country in New York Harbor on a rowboat hidden under a smelly fish tarp, where he was taken out to a ship and sent off to Brazil. Of course, when he went back to Rome, Archbishop Gaetano Bedini did not write a happy tale of his experience in the United States. In 1854, an anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic party known as the Know Nothings were formed. Know Nothing, of course, when they were asked what their platform stood for, they used the Sergeant Schultz answer, I know nothing. They controlled several state houses, governorships, and mayors in this period. The famous American cartoonist Thomas Nast has a whole series of frankly anti-Catholic cartoons. Notice the good American gentleman here protecting this mob of immigrants. And he's protecting this mob of immigrants from crocodiles. But if you look closely, the crocodile is a bishop wearing a mitre and crawling up out of the mud to attack the immigrants. Crew.
You can hear it here, but not there.
This allied to a second point. Beginning in the 1830s and 1840s, there was a movement in American culture to found common schools, public schools, mostly to Americanize all of these immigrants. Of course, because in every school you were taught civics, you were taught the Pledge of Allegiance, the picture of George Washington. You all remember this from grade school. The American flag, Abraham Lincoln. This is all the stuff that we all saw growing up. This all begins in the 1830s, 1840s. Very commonly, the local Protestant minister was the chair of the education department. So, of course, you were going to read the King James Bible. And of course, you would be taught correct Christianity. And of course, correct Christianity means that thank God for Martin Luther and King Henry VIII that threw off the yoke of the Roman whore of Babylon and purified religion. And all of a sudden, these little Irish kids are going to first grade and coming home and saying, Mommy and Daddy, do you know the scarlet whore of Babylon? And of course, Mommy and Daddy would go right to the parish priest, and the parish priest would go to the bishop. The first attempts were for the local clergy, Catholic bishops, to try to get the textbooks a little more neutral, to scratch out the anti-Catholic nastiness. Bishop John Hughes of New York pushes to allow Catholic schools to receive public funding, for which he is roundly rejected, and continues, that same position continues to be rejected today. In a response, in 1852, the First Plenary Council of Baltimore exhorts pastors to do whatever we can do to build and support a Catholic school to protect our immigrant children from being American Protestantized. Now, there are 2, 4, 5, 6, 7 of us in this room. How many of us went to a Catholic grade school? You didn't?
No, we were in the military.
Oh, you were in the military. Okay. You didn't either anymore.
But I had catechism in my home.
Ah, okay.
Right.
The Louisiana Compromise there.
Some of us did both because we were in the military and we weren't in the military. Then we went to Catholic school.
Okay, let's stop there and take some questions. First of all, any questions from the attendees?
So, John Carroll, the relationship between grace and nature, was it substantially different from Aquinas?
No. The question was Carroll substantially different from Aquinas? No, he was not. But because it was, see, Aquinas operates in a completely Catholic environment. So for Aquinas to think that nature would kind of grow up in a proper thing is one thing. For John Carroll to believe that that could happen in a completely Protestant environment is another. So in theory, they're very equal. The contexts are very different. Okay, any Zoom questions?
You were talking about the Irish being put down, but I remember also my grandmother, who was Czech, who was born in 1902. She said the Irish put down the Czechs. And when the Irish became, especially a lot of the Irish Catholic nuns, did not like the Czech kids and made a good point about it. So my grandmother always took it with a grain of salt. The Irish Catholic nuns. Yeah.
We talk about immigrant Catholicism.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, the immigrant pattern in the United States, you have to picture a ladder. The immigrant group that reaches the third rung of the ladder always wants to kick down the immigrant group that's on the second rung of the ladder. So by the time of your grandmother, the Irish were on the third, the Czechs were on the second, and they were working hard and climbing up. So therefore, kick them back down. That's a standard pattern.
Yep.
Oh, what you're talking about, and you've emphasized it already, is largely northern U.S. history. North Carolina and Tennessee had the fewest Catholics of any state in the Union. So we've got, if we were interested in looking at Southern Catholic history, we'd go to New Orleans and maybe Mobile and a few of the places you mentioned earlier, which are non-English based, you know. But here where we are, it's an immigrant church that we've got here. That is, say, from the north.
With a couple of exceptions, that in 1820, Richmond and Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah were named as dioceses. So the cities tended to have a model that was closer to this.
Mhm.
Once you get outside of the cities, absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
It's in a way similar to the density of Catholics in the triangle today. And you drive a half hour out and it's,
Yeah.
yeah.
And then also those cities that you mentioned would have very small, but nonetheless real Black Catholic populations. There just might be a few, but that is the origin of the Black Catholic Southern communities.
And the Black Catholic population we'll talk about again in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
Friar Tim,
No, let them talk.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry I can't get my camera on, but Holy Trinity, where we used to go, they had a old chapel that they said, or somebody claimed, was the oldest church in the United States. Is that off or?
I don't believe
They were Jesuits.
the oldest church in continuous use in the United States is San Fernando in Houston.
Okay.
In San Antonio, followed somewhat closely behind by Old St. Joe's in downtown Philadelphia.
And then Santa Fe.
And then there are the old Jesuit chapels in Southern Maryland, but they are no longer in continuous use. I'm not familiar with the Georgetown case particularly.
Okay. All right. Sorry. Thank you.
No problem.
I just had a comment to make that I found fascinating. John, share with everybody that's here, they're not seeing your chat, about the family pew.
Oh, yeah. No, I was just underscoring what Father Tim mentioned. When I grew up in Derby, Connecticut, we had a family pew, and referring also to the comment made about the Czechs. In Derby, there was an Irish church, St. Mary's. There was a Polish church, St. Michael's, and there was an Italian church at Our Lady of the Assumption. But anyhow, in our church, my grandfather, whose father had been a doctor, had the wherewithal to pay for a family pew. And our name was in a little marker on the back of the one in front, and we sat there all the time. So that was that. And then the second point you made about the quarters, Dad, when we moved to make our second church in Holy Infant in Orange, Connecticut, Dad stood at the door with a little table where people would drop a quarter into this tube, kind of like what's on right where the candles are. It was a plastic glass tube in those days. And the money would go down into the box, and then they could go through on their way into our church, our new church in Orange. So I saw both those steps of the rent pay by the people who came in for the church service.
Trace, did you want to?
No, I just thought that was cool when I saw
Yeah.
the chat. I mean,
Yep.
I don't know anyone that had their own family pews. I thought that was
You know all these old people now, Teresa.
Generally, most pastors, including me, are trying to get rid of the fees. Just last week, I abolished the funeral fees. At the beginning of the year, I abolished the Catholic Carolina rate fees. Because again, we're trying to get people away from the pray to pay mentality. As I jokingly put it, we want your experience of church to be closer to joining your local gym as opposed to buying a ticket each time you walk into a multiplex. You sustain your local gym even if you never walk into it. But when you want to walk into it, it's there for you. And that's really the mentality we need. I mean, I've used that example with trees more than once. Yeah.
When I was young and paying my 15 cents to get into church
Where?
in the Boston area.
Okay, this is a lot of New England. This hung with New England a long time.
But then I heard that the money changes for bad people. When we had money changes.
Absolutely. Yeah. 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 I mean, it's, you know, you talk about these, and that's simply the way in which it was done. Another question from Martin? Okay. All right. Now, from about 1830 up until 1920, there's continuous waves of immigrants. We'll talk about that in more detail next week. But by the end of the 19th century, American bishops had discovered a little bit more of John Carroll's vision and attempted to resurrect it. And they attempted to resurrect it for a couple of very clear reasons. One, the Catholic Church in the United States was growing by millions every year due to immigrants, and then immigrants who had many children and huge churches, convents, rectories, schools, gymnasia, orphanages, etc. The American church was flourishing in the United States. In the latter part of the 19th century, Italy was essentially excommunicated because the King of Italy stole the Papal States. France was officially excommunicated because its government did not recognize the church. The church in Germany was being persecuted by Ludwig von Bismarck in what was called the Kulturkampf, in which he tried to insist that Germanism was equal to Protestantism. And the church in Poland was under the thumb of either the Germans or the Russians. The Irish church was under the thumb of the Anglican Brits and persecuted. So virtually everywhere else in the world, the church is going down the tubes, except in the United States. So American bishops look and they say, well, all those European churches that have tried to be too rigid, look what trouble they got themselves into. Well, because we know how to accommodate these changed circumstances, we are flourishing. And the liberal wing of the American hierarchy really began to underline the importance of being American and Catholic. This is also, by the way, the United States becomes a world power in 1898 by defeating Spain in the Spanish-American War and seizing colonies. And a lot of these colonies, like Cuba, Guam, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines, are full of Catholics. So these Americanist American bishops think that we're in an optimistic Catholic moment. The moment when Catholicism will really become the dominant thing in America has arrived. In a sense, the patron saint of this was Isaac Hecker. Isaac Hecker was a convert to Catholicism. He joined the Redemptorist community, was ordained a priest, and then founded founded the first authentically American Catholic community of priests, the Paulists. And his whole goal was that mass media, at this time, this will be printing, cheap little books, mass media would convert the United States to Catholicism. Extremely idealistic, extremely American, extremely optimistic. After he died, the Paulists began to promote his canonization. They talked one of the Paulists, Father Walter Elliott, into writing a life of Father Hecker, published in 1891. A French priest named Felix Klein translated it, but sharpened the language considerably, and in a preface referred to Hecker as the ideal modern priest, perfectly in harmony with modern science, perfectly in harmony with modern culture, perfectly in harmony with everything. Why? Because he's inner-directed by the Holy Spirit. He's not beholden to some fat Irish Monsignor telling him what to do. He listens to the Holy Spirit. And he listens to the Holy Spirit with typically modern virtues, like hard work, industry, initiative. All of those old-fashioned virtues, like humility and patience, well, those are good for the backward peasants back in Europe. But what the modern world needs is these active virtues. Now, I'll tell you my story that I always use to exemplify this. When I was a seminarian in Rome, those were the years when Mother Teresa was trying to found her first house in Rome. And all of Catholic Rome gathered together to raise money for Mother Teresa, who was already an international hero. The North American College, the American Seminary, decided that they were going to support Mother Teresa by holding a talent show benefit. And the seminarian, who had been a former DJ, was the host of it. So you have to picture, like, and now presenting the French horns of the French National Guard. And then during the intermission, they had a little clip of Mother Teresa. We must take care of the poor, and we must sacrifice for the suffering and the dying and the people in the purpose of the Lord Jesus Christ. And the proceeds of all of this went to Mother Teresa. That same night, the Comunità di Sant'Egidio, which is grew out of a student-run organization in Rome. That same night, the Comunità di Sant'Egidio held a 24-hour fast, and all the money that they would have used for food, they gave to Mother Teresa. Fasting, as opposed to 3 cheers to the American College. Active, passive virtues. This French translation was attacked by another Frenchman who wrote a book, Is Father Hecker a Saint? And the answer is absolutely not. In fact, he's really a Protestant. He is so non-Catholic you cannot believe it. He's an Anglo-Saxon infiltrator into the church. Such that the Master of the Sacred Palace, which is a very antique title in Rome, it's always held by a Dominican, and it's the Pope's personal theologian. So the master of the sacred palace granted his imprimatur. So all of a sudden it looked like Rome was after this. Why is everybody so upset? If you really believe that everybody just listens to the Holy Spirit, then what about church discipline? What about listening to your pastor or to your bishop or to the Pope? It's all about you and the Holy Spirit. You don't need these mediators. Secondly, are active virtues really better than passive? Is figuring out how to wash the windows most effectively a better sign of holiness than long-suffering patience in illness? Traditional religious vows like poverty and chastity and obedience, those are useless in this kind of world. That's old-fashioned stuff. If everything is internal, then it leads the great big bugaboo in traditional Catholic circles in the United States is the word indifference. If everything is all the same, then nothing matters. That's indifference, indifferentism. If you talk about America being so perfect and so special, don't forget the fact that this is against church teaching. The effectiveness. In 1899, Pope Leo XIII issues a private letter to James Cardinal Gibbons, the Archbishop of Baltimore, more or less the leader of the liberal American wing of the American episcopacy, in which he formally condemns as a heresy the heresy called Americanism. We have a heresy named after us. It condemns any attempt to accommodate doctrine. What says, if you have to accommodate the different social situations, that's okay. But don't you dare touch doctrine. Secondly, while you live in a democratic republic, and you can vote people in and out of office as we just did, don't you go thinking about doing that in the church. The church is not a democracy. The church is a monarchy with its aristocracy. And, by the way, the whole question of religious liberty, separation of church and state, that's against church teaching. So don't even go there with any of that stuff either. Again, this purely interior Holy Spirit and exaltation of active virtues is a problem. Now, how did the American church respond? The Americanists say, oh, Holy Father, absolutely, these things are reprehensible. But none of us have ever believed any of that. None of us have ever done any of that. The Archbishop of New York, leader of the conservatives, thank you. This was a very opportune correction. The Archbishop of Milwaukee says, you're just like the early Jansenists. We catch you with your tail hanging out, and then you deny that it actually happened. Felix Klein, the early writer, calls it a phantom heresy. That it's there, but it's like a ghost. You can't quite get your fingers on it. And let's be honest, most of us slip into this. We are incredibly pragmatic. We are incredibly initiative-taking. We believe in clear structures and getting things done. It frustrates any American who has to be in an international meeting of other priests because they drive us nuts. They talk for hours and nothing happens. Now, this all pretty much goes underground through the 20s and the 30s. But in the post-war period, there's another whole resurgence of how can you be American and Catholic. This is the period of growth in suburbs, which essentially means that all those great ethnic neighborhoods of these big northern and upper Midwest cities, everybody starts going, as they say in Baltimore, out the road into the suburbs. And there we have a less ethnic, more homogeneous American culture. Things like cars, things like detached houses with no porches and fences around your backyard, tended to make things more private, isolated, and individual, and less communal as a group. Suburbs increased mostly because of the 1944 GI Bill of Rights. That is, some blue-collar son of an ethnic family went off to war, came back, got himself a bachelor's degree, got himself a white collar instead of a blue one, got into a Studebaker or Ford, and moved out the road with his 2.2 children and driveway. It's essentially what happened. The Catholic Church becomes much more middle class, wealthy, and accommodating. It's increasingly assimilated into American culture. There is no longer this ethnic identification, but a more homogeneous Catholic identification. Incidentally, this is the period, including here in North Carolina, where the Catholic Church begins to desegregate. So again, it's much more of a blending in instead of keeping of separations. There are three important texts that need to be just talked about here. First, Will Herber in 1955, a sociologist of American religion, has a work entitled Catholic, Protestant, and Jew. And his basic point is, everybody's an American. There's an American Catholic, which is a little distinct from an American Protestant, a little distinct from an American Jew, but basically they're all American, they all get along. Today, we would have to update that. Catholic, Protestant, Jew, Muslim, Hindu. But the same process is slowly happening. In 1949, Paul Blanchard writes another anti-Catholic screed. American freedom and Catholic power. That is, as Americans, as Catholics assume control and power, it threatens the United States. This is still echoed in the great 1960 election of John F. Kennedy, who had to win the West Virginia primary, which was only 3% Catholic, to prove that he could win outside of the Catholic enclave. In 1960, Jesuit priest John Courtney Murray attempts to connect Thomist thought with American democratic ideals in a work called We Hold These Truths to be Self-Evident. Murray is condemned by the Holy See. He is rehabilitated at the Second Vatican Council and becomes one of the theological experts behind the council. Catholic pop culture comes to the fore. For a number of years, the highest rated TV show was built to Bishop Fulton Sheen. Fulton Sheen came out in his full Episcopal garb, including the scarlet red feather overall, dramatically writing on his blackboard. Of course, a number of you remember Fulton Sheen. And if you notice, Fulton Sheen rarely talked about really Catholic things like Mary, Eucharist. He talked about virtue. He talked about civic pride. He talked about patriotism. Another sign of us blending in. In the 1950s, one of the best-selling books is the autobiography of a Trappist monk, The Seven-Story Mountain, by Thomas Merton. Monsignor John Tracy Ellis, the Dean of American Catholic Historians in this period, in 1955 writes a very influential book entitled American Catholics and the Intellectual Life. And he basically raised the question, that we have invested billions of dollars into school systems, and have we ever produced a Nobel laureate? Have we ever produced a luminary? Have we ever produced an intellectual leader? And Tracy Ellis's answer was no. Why? Because we talk about discipline and conformity much more than we talk about intellectual rigor. A self-imposed ghetto mentality, quote, unquote. Tracy Ellis's book has a huge spurt. The post-war period sees a huge growth in Catholic colleges, a huge growth in vocations, a huge growth in professionalization. It's in this period, for example, that clergy obtained secular degrees. The religious sisters who taught in schools only taught in schools with a high school education. It's only in the 1950s that they went to get bachelor's degrees and master's degrees. There's this entire kind of professionalization leading up to the Land O'Lakes document of 1967, which talks about how to maintain Catholic identity while still having intellectual and academic freedom. Most conservatives look at the Land O'Lakes doctrine as like one of the worst things that ever happened, and view the papal corrective ex corde ecclesiae out of the heart of the church as too little, too late to try to solve the secularizing tendencies of American universities. There's also a period, Catholic anti-communism. Joe McCarthy, don't forget, was a good Catholic. McCarthy believed that the State Department and the Defense Department were riddled with communist spies, which is how we lost China and almost lost Korea, which led us into, as well, the Vietnam War. Brother Leonard Feeney, the Catholic chaplain at Harvard, talk about assimilating. Talk about accommodating. The Catholic chaplain at Harvard, Father Feeney, began to preach an overly rigid interpretation of the ancient dictum extra ecclesiam nulla salus, which translates as outside of the Catholic Church there is no salvation. It was so rigid, and of course, it was meant to exclude 99% of Harvard, that Feeney was silenced by the Archbishop of Boston, went into schism for a time, and was finally only reconciled on his deathbed. This is the struggle of, as we accommodate more and more into Americanism and into the American values, what does it mean? It's during this period that many of the things that mark us off as distinctively Catholic end. Lenten and Friday penitential practices. Do not think that McDonald's invented the big fish witch because they thought people liked fish. In the early years, they saw every Friday their profits dropped because Catholics would not come and eat a hamburger on Friday. So therefore, the big fish witch was the way to get Catholics to come in. Once this, and again, those of you of a certain age, when you went out on a Friday and you looked around as a group, and you looked around who got fish and who got hamburgers, and who got pasta with meat sauce and who got pasta with cheese, you figured out who the other Catholics were. And that's precisely what this did. Church architecture. You know, some people complain that modern Catholic churches sometimes look like barns with a cross on top. They don't look, quote unquote, Catholic. Leadership is more collegial. There's less stress from hierarchy. People don't wear religious habits or religious garb as much. especially the religious women. They're talking about ecumenism and interreligious efforts. It's also during this period that I like to remind people that in these new suburbs, one of the phenomena when you drive through these 1950 suburbs is how many, quote unquote, Our Lady of the Bathtubs there are in front lawns. Now you're laughing because you know exactly what I'm talking about. Now they were an act of piety at the time, but notice what it also did. When you walk down the street, you could say, that's a Catholic house. I know where the Catholics are. So we're not all homogeneous. It's interesting how this stuff grows up around the same time. If you were to look at us today, most of us think there's absolutely no problem with being American and Catholic. We're very much in love with American culture. We're successful. We're Americanized. Most of us have assimilated away anything that is too distinctively Catholic. Very rarely do you see a young family with Our Lady of the Bathtub in their front lawn. Very rarely do you see people with kind of overt religiosity. This, by the way, is one of the reasons why it's so hard to get contemporary American Catholics like this to evangelize and to speak about their faith, because we've been taught that you have to go along to get along. So you don't want to be too distinctive and too different about these things. We've accommodated our Catholicism. Now here, this is an equal opportunity accommodation. Traditionalists would say that liberal Catholics have accommodated away Catholic teaching on sexuality, gender, and abortion. Liberal Catholics would say Catholics at the other side has completely accommodated away distinctive Catholic teaching on the right of immigrants and the care for the poor. And there's some argument, and there's some validity to both sides of this. The Catholicism that I would describe in the United States is pretty wide, but not very deep. I think, Lauren, I've used the phrase with you that I fear for your generation, which has a mile-wide Catholicism with about an inch deep. And if somebody pushes it too hard, it doesn't know how to respond. Growing up in the last couple of years has been what we call an evangelical style. There's always been this, but this is a little bit more of a contemporary phenomenon. The evangelical style basically talks about people either converting to Catholicism, like gangbusters, or what they call a revert to Catholicism. That is, I was raised Catholic, I lost it in college, I couldn't care less about it, but I came back like gangbusters when I was 25. That's a revert. Okay, that's a revert. This class of American Catholics believes that the American culture needs conversion, but they don't agree on conversion to what? The conservatives would say that it needs conversion around stopping being a culture of death, quote unquote, to use the phrase of John Paul II. Liberals would say it needs a conversion to its open, welcoming heart of welcoming immigrants and being a place of safety, giving your poor, your tired, your public masses, which we've forgotten. Both the same gospel. The nuns on the bus and the Sisters for Life appeal to the same gospel. They just appeal to different chapters of it. Okay? And both see that there's something wrong with American culture. Very commonly, these are the people that would look for things to be more distinctively Catholic. So what are the things that are most distinctively Catholic that become hot-button issues here? Eucharist, Latin Mass, not Latin Mass, gather us in or Tantum Ergo. Okay? Eucharist. Marian piety, maid crownings, public rosary outside of abortion clinics. Overt loyalty to the Pope, except for many of them, not so much the current Pope. And things that are distinctively Catholic. 5, 6, 7 children. Overt religious medals. Young religious women wearing floor-to-ceiling hats, etc. There's a movement to have a little bit more distinctive Catholicism. Since American religion is voluntary and privatized, it's understandable that some people are going to have stronger reactions to it. And that's this whole evangelical approach. And among some of this cohort, there's a nostalgia for what seems like the solid, strong, good old days of the 1940s and 1950s, with hundreds of priests and thousands of nuns and hundreds of little girls in First Communion white, and it all seems so solid and strong and formidable. But unfortunately, it all went away in the 60s and 70s. So among some, there's a nostalgia for this. But the bottom line is, virtually all of us are comfortable in our Americanism, but we do always need to raise the question of how can we be both American and Catholic? Comments, questions? We'll start with Zoom first. If any Zoomers have any comments or questions?
John Kavanaugh.
John Kavanaugh.
Go ahead, John.
Sure. I know you're going to talk about slavery at another time, so I don't want to go there. But where would you place the people like Coughlin and others in the 30s, in the nativistic, coming out of the eugenics movement, sort of quasi, and I don't want to go too far in the pro-Hitler kind of thing, but they were very, I guess is the lightning rod for that. Would you put him in that nativist kind of heritage?
Absolutely.
And then what is there a current thread that could be traced back to that as well?
You're talking Charles Kaufman, correct?
Right.
Yeah. For those of you unfamiliar, Charles Kaufman was a famous radio priest operating out of a series of radio stations in the upper Midwest. He was the pastor of the Shrine of the Little Flower in outside of Detroit. His radio preaching was immensely popular. It was also rather strongly and strikingly anti-Semitic. He was, in the 1930s, first an ally of FDR in his first term, turned against him in his second term, and began to refer to FDR almost as a communist. Coughlin is one of these odd figures because he doesn't fit very easily into kind of the mainstream approach. He's a very powerful voice at the time, but it's a voice, in a sense, almost like Huey Long in Louisiana, of kind of a populist, rabble-rousing, let's stay with populist, I think that's a good term, a populist type. The problem with populism in American culture is that it finds it very difficult to find a successor. Populism in American culture tends to revolve around one charismatic leader. And I'll say kind of the obvious today. I think many people are going to be questioning how much will the post-2020 Republican Party represent Donald Trump or not? That's going to be an open question, because I think Donald Trump has certainly tapped into some of the same populist strains that go back to Coughlin and Huey Long. Okay, questions from the in-house. Lauren first, then Kyle.
I think I listened to a podcast by Tiffany, regularly speaking, there's one meeting group, one American Creed, and they always talk about Americans and flying and heresy and how the
Yeah.
They talk all the time about like the American flag and churches and how that is great and such, and talk about that.
Okay. Lauren raised the point again on Americanism is why is it in the United States that virtually every Catholic church has an American flag? You know, it is very bizarre because nowhere in Europe do you ever find a national flag in a church. You just simply will not find it. In the United States, the flag went there mainly to prove that we really were American. Now, interestingly, in my home parish, when I would sit in the pew, the American flag was here and the papal flag was there, which gently reminded my Polish forebears of, you know, exactly what we're talking about. But it's American Catholics, depending on where they are, have always felt a little bit alien and not quite a part of things. And that has not gone away. The Jesuit theologian and historian Mark Massa out of Fordham University wrote a book some years back called The Last Acceptable American Prejudice, which is anti-Catholicism. And again, you go to a polite cocktail party, you can't make a joke about black people, you can't make a joke about Jews, you can't make a joke about gays, but you could make a joke about the Pope and pedophiles. You get away with it. It's the last acceptable American prejudice. So in the United States, we've always felt this tendency to rally around the flag. And it got undermined in the 1950s around Joe McCarthy and anti-communism. But yeah, it's a very typical American phenomenon. By the way, all the years that I lived in Italy, I never once heard the Italian national anthem or an Italian national song sung in a church. God forbid if on July 4th weekend, Jesse doesn't put America the Beautiful or Battle Hymn, not down south, Battle Hymn, probably not. America the Beautiful or My Country 'Tis of Thee or something, because it's just expected here. But that's so American. Kind of.
You brought up the term of incident.
Yes.
And I've never been clear about exactly what it is.
Okay, I'll do that with you afterwards, because that's a little bit involved, and it has nothing to do with this. Okay. Any other questions?
I read a lot about Saul Alinsky and his influence in the Catholic Church. Any comments on that?
Okay, Saul Alinsky is the originator of community organizing, basically out of Chicago in the 60s and 70s. Community organizing, that is gathering people together. Alinsky's point was you gather people together so that their voice can be more effectively heard to resolve problems.
Mm-hmm.
And that's precisely what Justice United does in Orange. Orange County Justice United is precisely that. Community organizing, gathering people who have either silent or quiet voices because they're poor or dispossessed, and give them more of a sense of voice. Very commonly, this was picked up in Catholic circles because of the Catholic communitarian nature. That is, it is vital to us to gather together as a community and exist in communion. Just to give you a point. When we were unable to gather for Eucharist for those months, and I would have Zoom conversations with you, and then in those first couple of weeks, when people were able to come back into communion, the common refrain that I heard is, I missed communion and I missed my community. And I always took the opportunity to say, do you realize that those two words are very similar? And that's Catholic. So it is, from a Catholic perspective, very Eucharistic to organize communities. And this is where American individualism is at countenance with American ideals and things. For example, throughout all of Europe, the most potent expressions of Catholicism today are what they call the new ecclesial movements. That is, communities and groups of people banded together, either under the charismatic renewal, or under Santa Gidio, or under community of liberation, or under the new catechumenate, et cetera, et cetera. They all involve basically forming small faith groups. It's hard in the United States to get small faith groups off the ground. We have them here. There's about 6 or 8 of them that are very fundamental and long-lasting, but it's hard to get new ones started. Again, an American sociologist of religion some years back, and I'm blanking on the name because I'm trying to sum it. Bowling Alone anyway, the book is called Bowling Alone. And it's the rise of individualism and the loss of community in the United States. The title comes from this fact. Every year, more people bowl more frames than the year before. Less people do it in organized leagues. And the point is, I would rather bowl when I feel like it, with whom I feel like it, as I feel like it, than have to meet you every Friday night at 8 o'clock at the bowling lane. Because I don't want to be too tied to you. That's very American. Robert Putnam, thank you. I knew I'd summed it up in the back of my head. Robert Putnam. He's well worth reading, by the way, if you've never read it. Yes.
In my neighborhood, there's a Bible study group.
Mm-hmm.
I believe that they're all evangelical.
Yes.
Bible study is very common, according to what I hear from people who are not right.
Yes.
It's not Catholic, but it's the concept, isn't it?
It is the concept. And those are beginning more and more. And they're beginning more and more. This is my opinion now, because I'll do a little social analysis. Previously, in evangelical churches, Bible study usually occurred on Wednesday evenings or Thursday or Sunday afternoons in the church. They've since moved into these small faith groups. Why? In my opinion, evangelical Protestants are beginning to feel that they're not quite as well welcomed in an increasingly secular American culture. So they are banding together into small faith groups of some kind. The best-selling religious book of 2 or 3 years ago was by someone who converted from Catholicism to Orthodoxy, I believe, a man by the name of Rod Dreher, D-R-E-H-E-R. And his text is called the Benedict Option. And it's Benedict, not after Pope Benedict, but Benedict after Saint Benedict. That is, the culture is so lost to us that we have to withdraw from it and form almost like little monastic communities, such that we could go back out and reconvert it. Another example of it is the charismatic covenant community that Amy Coney Barrett belonged to, People of Praise, which has 1,400 members, started off in Notre Dame and has since been spread out. It's another manifestation of the same kind of mission. It's this unease with our culture. And again, maybe we don't feel it as much, but certainly, Laura, you feel it in the university. It's a very secular environment, and it's no longer cool or okay to be a Christian. That's increasing in our culture, and that's feeding into some of the stuff that we're talking about now.
Friar Tim,
Yes.
are you going to talk at all about the Catholic Conference of Bishops and their evolution as kind of a parallel development to the socialization of Catholicism in the US, or because they seem to be in some ways a delayed reflection of it, or?
I wasn't planning on it, but I can do it very briefly now.
Okay.
Okay. In the 19th century, the American Catholic Church gathered regularly in the earlier sessions in what were called plenary councils. I'm sorry, provincial councils. There were 7 provincial councils of Baltimore that happened about every 5 years or so. In the latter part of the 19th century, there were 3 plenary councils, all held in Baltimore. The third one mandated a common catechism that we all know as the Baltimore Catechism. Okay. And that was how the bishops operated as a group. After the pontificate of Pius IX, who underlined papal infallibility, Pius IX was not a particular friend of collegial gatherings of bishops. Therefore, that tended to simmer, and American Catholic archbishops would meet once a year, and essentially they would meet once a year to name or to make suggestions of who would be the next bishops. In the First World War, the American bishops decided that they needed to gather together in order to mobilize Catholics to be a part of the First World War effort, and then afterwards to send aid to stricken countries in Europe. Out of what was called the National Catholic Welfare Council, NCWC, that grew into what we would call today the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. The United States Conference of Catholic Bishops today has 2 arms. One is its lobbying arm. Its lobbying arm lobbies the federal government for Catholic interests. Its other arm is the internal arm of running the church. The bishops generally meet twice a year, once in November for a week. They should be meeting this week or next week, but it's been canceled because of COVID. And there, they set policy for the American Catholic Church. Now, the role of Episcopal conferences is a somewhat hotly debated question in Catholic ecclesiology. That is the way the church governs. After the immediate time of the Second Vatican Council, certain Episcopal conferences began to push a much more progressive agenda. under the pontificate of John Paul II, these were reined back in. And now, Episcopal conferences require a near unanimity in their voting before anything is sent to Rome to be okayed, which effectively makes it extremely difficult for Episcopal conferences to come up with some statements. Pope Francis has shifted the conversation somewhat in the opposite direction, giving more authority to Episcopal conferences, which has led the Catholic right to accuse him of sowing confusion. So, for example, Amoris Laetitia, in its famous footnote that talks about the admission of people divorced and civilly remarried without an annulment, has left the handling of that up to Episcopal conferences, which has led, not surprisingly, to the Episcopal Conference of Germany adopting a liberal position and the Episcopal Conference of Poland adopting a conservative position. So therefore, who can go to communion is different now in Poland than it is in Germany. So that's basically where we are with the USCCB. Did that answer your question, Pete?
Yes, thank you, Friar Tim. That helps a lot. Appreciate it.
Okay, next week we will talk about immigration. We'll start with the Irish, then the Germans, and then we'll move into the Poles, the Slavs, and the Italians. And then in 1925, America closes its immigration doors, and that reopens again in 1965. And then we'll talk a little bit about Hispanic Catholics and Asian Catholics, African Catholics, all of whom are in significant numbers. Thank you for your patience. I hope you found this interesting.
Great stuff. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Thanks, Therese.
See you later.
Bye.
Thank you, Therese.
Oh, you're most welcome. This is fun.
Okay. This is
Bye, Jan.